what the initiates received through the enactment was really understanding the experiential knowledge that lies beyond death. So not just symbolic reassurance. Hecate's functioning that is really to illuminate the threshold, look clearly and see what's destroyed and then what comes after.
Lenni George is a British Greek Cypriot researcher and herbalist whose work engages with ancient sources and their later reception. Over more than 3 decades, she has developed a sustained interest in botanical traditions and in sources such as the Greek Magical Papyri, particularly in relation to the figure of Hekate. Together with Nat Clegg, she runs the House of Sophiel, organizing workshops and events on esotericism, creativity, and symbolism. She holds a PhD from Birmingham City University and has an extensive international background in training and capacity development. This dual perspective informed her recent book, The Rites of Hekate, From the Dirt to the Divine, which I have here. I don't know if you can see that well. This is the book that we will be talking about, The Rites of Hekate. Magnificent book that we will be introducing and exploring certain parts. And it's a book which explores actually the relationship between historical material and contemporary engagement. And that is also what I find particularly interesting in this book, is that it's also very, very personal. And then you get the real story behind this interest that she has, she portrays for this divinity, right? So, Lenni, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's my pleasure, Andrea. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and of course, to talk with you is always a delight.
Same from me. And actually, we just to introduce the subject, because as you know, this website, the New Mithraic, is really related about Mithras, but not only. Actually, we have also talked with Peter McAdams about the Dionysian cult, or like a tradition or mysteries. We have talked about also the Solabusca and its relation. So we have talked also about other subjects that are related to other divinities from the ancient world, also philosophy and other things that matters to us, right? And Hecate, it's a divinity. It's a goddess that is difficult to. I mean, it's not very found in the Mithraic context, but it was a very, 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 very big goddess from the ancient world. And then that will be very interesting to try also to see the relationships between these two gods and these two different traditions, right? Like that merge within antiquity. So, but let's start from the beginning. The first question that I think everyone would like to know, for myself as well, because I learned a lot with your book. I didn't know that much about Hecate, to be honest. I knew that was a goddess, and then I was associated her with the Hellenistic times. But I've learned a lot with your book. And then I would like you to explain to our audience also, where does Hecate actually come from, and what are the earliest sources we have that mentions her?
Oh, thank you, Andrea. Thank you. So I think the question of the origin of Hecate is genuinely complicated or complex. And in many ways, I think that's also a clue to her nature. So the earliest substantial Greek source is in Hesiod's Theogony, which was written around about 700 BCE. And in Theogony, which is basically a family tree of the gods, if you like, Hecate appears not as a peripheral figure, but as a goddess of extraordinary scope. So Hesiod describes Zeus as having honoured Hecate above all others, and in doing that, she has a share in the earth, the sea, and the sky. And that breadth of dominion is unusual even in the Greek pantheon. Most deities have clearly bounded domains, with its Hades or Poseidon. But she actually is given dominion across all three. And she's understood to be a Titan. She's a Titaness. So she's the daughter of Perseus and Asteria, which places her actually outside and predates the Olympian family. And interestingly, looking at the friezes at Lagina, there is one of the friezes which suggests that Hecate actually witnessed the birth of Zeus. And as we know, she fought alongside the Olympians against the Titans. So her kind of her starting point in Hellenistic terms goes back really to that work, which was 700 BCE. I think that clearly there are arguments that she predates the Greek pantheon and the Hellenistic origins. And the temple at Lagina in southwest Turkey is dedicated to Hecate, and it's really interesting that that's one of one of the strongest examples that we have of Hecate worship or Hecate following outside of the Greek pantheon and in Caria. And so there are ideas that really she's from Asia Minor. There's also another argument that comes up through names in the PGM, in the Greek Magical Papyri, where she's referenced as Perseus, Hecate Perseus, and it's not really clear, is that a reference to the daughter of Perseus, the Titan, or is that a reference to being from Persia? And so it's not actually clear. So her origins are left unclear.
So actually, it's similar also when we talk about the similarities between Mithras and then Hecate, and then you see another similarity there when you talk about the possible origins from Persia, for instance, right? Like it's exactly what happens with Mithras, even though there is this discussion about what is the extent of that connection with Persia or with the Eastern world. Another institution that was very important during the Hellenic period was the Eleusinian Mysteries, right? Where one of the most important religious institutions of the ancient world, and Hecate is not always at the center of this story, but she plays a crucial role. Could you tell us more about her function in the myth of Demeter and Persephone, and also within the mysteries of Eleusis?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, she's not a central role in terms of the relationship between Demeter and Persephone, but really central in the movement of the story. So in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, we learn that Hecate hears Persephone's cries at the moment of abduction. But Hecate doesn't actually intervene at that point. That's not her function, but she witnesses. And from witnessing that, she goes to Demeter and tells her what she's heard. And then she is the one that takes up her torches and accompanies Demeter in the search. And I think this is quite an important detail that tends to get overlooked. So she's not the rescuer, but she is the one who stands at the threshold of the event, and she's the one who provides the light by which others can navigate. And so in the Eleusinian Mysteries themselves, the initiates were called the Epoptai, and that really meant those who have seen. And after culminating the vision of the ritual, and Hecate's torch-bearing role is really sort of structurally essential to that seeing. So we can see that Hecate's role is about illumination, is about bringing the light, and is about enabling people to see. So the mysteries themselves enact the myth of loss and return. So Persephone is taken, Demeter is devastated, and she's made the world barren. I love that idea of kind of the tiger mum. If you don't give me back my daughter, I will raise this planet. I will leave it barren completely. And then it's about the retrieval and the reunion. And what the initiates received through the enactment was really understanding the experiential knowledge that lies beyond death. So not just symbolic reassurance. And I think Hecate's functioning in that is really to illuminate the threshold. She's the one that makes it possible to stand at the boundary between and look clearly and see what's destroyed, and then what comes after. And I think it's also quite significant that after Persephone's return, it's Hecate who becomes her companion in the underworld, not Hermes. but and not Demeter. And I think maybe at that point we're also starting to register the psychopump function that Hecate has, and maybe that psychopump function has then found its real home.
We'll talk about the psychopop function as well, but before that, you talk about seeing about these visions, right? And that is one of the things that we know about Eleusinian mysteries, right? Like we know that, or it is almost, we are almost certain that they drink a special drink that was called kikeon. Maybe you can correct me in my pronunciation.
That's good. That's good. Kikion.
Kikeon,
Yes, that's great.
which is almost certainly included ergot, which is a fungus known to induce altered states of consciousness. In your book, you also inventory many other toxic plants, and that is one of your interests, right? Botanics and then herbs and things like that. So, and then you inventory that. That is one of the things that is very interesting in your book, because you will find all these reference to different herbs from antiquity that are that we can find today, and their relation with Hecate. Can you explain a little bit what is that relationship between Hecate and these different drugs that we are talking about?
Hecate's association with the dark botanicals is old and consistent, and I think it was Diodorus Siculus who talks about Hecate's experimentation with aconite. And there's one lovely story that she found the plant aconite and was experimenting with it and to understand the degree of poison. And so when strangers visited, I think it was suggested she was in Colchis at this point. When visitors came to Colchis, she would prepare meals and food for them with different amounts of aconite to understand its potency. So so aconite, belladonna, hemlock, mandrake, datura, they all are within Hecate's garden, if you like, and certainly in her connection with Medea, who was a pharmacist, a worker of plant medicines and magic. And in fact, the word pharmake itself is an ancient Greek word that covers what we would now separate out into medicine, poison, and magic. And that, for me, is a very kind of seductive and potent area of study. So, because in many of the things that we identify as poisons or could kill, we can also identify a cure. And so we can flip between this kill and cure quality of many of the plants and the botanicals that are in Hecate's garden. And Hecate presided over all three of those, and that's not incidental. And the goddess of thresholds, altered states of consciousness, threshold technology, moving the practitioner from one mode of perception to another, I think sits very central. And of course, the ritual use of plants was not recreational and not without its dangers. It required expertise, it required the knowledge of the pharmacies. And that's why it's so embedded in ritual structure rather than just used freely. What we're trying to do with those substances is to change the perceptual frame, and you need a container for that. And I think Hecate is the keeper of the thresholds, is a part of that container in her own right. So that's really how a lot of my interest in working with Hecate started, was to understand this relationship between medicine, magic, and poison. And so that's where it came from.
As we move into the Hellenistic and Roman periods, her figure, the figure of Hecate, seems to expand and transform. As you explain in your book, she has been transforming all along the history. And in Roman religion, she is identified with Trivia, which was a Roman goddess associated with also with crossroads, with liminal spaces, and also with the underworld. How did the Romans interpret Hecate in this context?
Well, I mean, as we know, the Romans, what was always interesting about the Romans is that their preparedness, rather than to try and quell or crush deities and worship, would very happily absorb them. And actually, if you think about the name Trivia, It's a Latin rendering of Hecate's Greek crossroads function. So tri via, three ways, the three road crossroads. So it tells you that the Romans recognized her domain immediately and had no difficulty assimilating her. Of course, what the Romans did was she became very closely associated with Diana and Luna, and that was producing the triple goddess formulation that Virgil used in Aeneid. So Luna in the sky, Diana on the earth, and Hecate in the underworld. And I think maybe that's a bit of a tidying up operation in one sense, and I think Romans quite like their theological taxonomy is reasonably clean. So mapping her across the three domains and the three familiar figures gave quite a structural legibility, so that we maybe didn't have quite in the earlier Greek material. I think what's interesting is what gets amplified and what gets compressed. So her role in magic, particularly in the context of necromancy and the chthonic ritual, becomes much more pronounced in the Roman literary tradition. So Horace, Virgil, Lucan, she appears in their work primarily in those darker registers. So the philosophical depth that she carries in Hesiod and the sense of the vast honor and sovereignty tends to kind of recede a bit in the Roman versions of Hecate or Trivia. And so she's more specifically connected with the underworld. I don't think she's diminished exactly, but I think she's narrowed. And this had already begun a little in the Hellenistic process anyway, with the triple form, the three-faced or the three-bodied image becoming the more dominant visual representation. So we see the Hecate on the triple form pillar, or the statue placed at the crossroads or in doorways. And that was spread across the Greek and the Roman world. And I think the first triple form statue actually was found in Athens, or it was created in Athens, I think around about 430 BCE. So there were actually very, very early examples of the triple form, but that later was taken on much more strongly in the Roman connection.
You also describe how Hecate becomes central in magical traditions. Actually, I think today is known for that, right? Like for witchcraft and magical traditions. We will see how we get into that. But already in the Hellenistic times or later on, she becomes like a central figure in that matter, in everything that is related to magical tradition, let's say. And we see it especially in the Greek Magical Papyri. What makes these texts so important for understanding her cult, and how do you reflect on the merging of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman traditions?
Yeah, I think the PGM, as we call them, are really fascinating. So they dated roughly from the 2nd century BCE to the 5th century CE. So we cover quite an expansion of time. And they're extraordinary because they're not theological treatises; they're actual working documents. So it's collections from different places, and we saw quite a lot of mingling from Egyptian traditions, Greek traditions, Roman traditions, Coptic, a whole range of different influences appearing in this collection, and because they're working documents, they record actual ritual procedures. What they say, what they do, what hour, how to construct an amulet, how to invoke a deity. So they're really rich in telling us about the use of magic and the practice of magic in those periods. And I think there's a lot of close attention to these processes. Of course, I think there's also a lot of potential for misinterpretation and misunderstanding as well, but we have a really great body of work there to draw from. Hecate appears throughout, right across the PGM. So I think she's directly mentioned 18 times, but it appears in all her different names and different forms many, many times over, and you can see those links to her. And whether that's calling Hecate and her horde to help with a love spell, or whether it's a protection, but she's very clearly quite central to many of the rites and rituals that are described there. And I think you also see that a relationship between the sort of synchronistic world of Hellenistic and the Roman and Egyptian world. So absorbing aspects of Isis, of Selene, of Persephone, and using the names alongside Egyptian divine names, Semitic Voce Magicae. I don't think that's a confusion or a carelessness. I think it's consistent with the logic of the world, in which deities are understood to have multiple names, multiple faces, and it was the practitioner's job to know how to address the right aspect and the right power for the right purpose. So I think the papyri really demonstrate continuous living, technically sophisticated practice associated with her, and not confined to any ethnic or cultural tradition. And that breadth itself is part of her nature, always operating outside the boundaries or any sanctioned religious aspect.
And actually, you were talking about this centrality, but she is particularly central, Hecate, in the Chaldean oracles. Hecate seems to take a much more elevated and almost metaphysical role in there. And then we have also Proclus, that calls her life-giving and intellectually luminous. And Damascus could describe her as a bridge between the material and divine worlds. So this is, you just mentioned before her role as a psychopomp. Can you talk a little bit more about this connection with later philosophical interpretations, like those on the Chaldean oracles, or also on the Porphyry's Cave of the Nymphs, which we see this like a role in this case of more the Mithras tradition, but also this psychopomp role?
Yeah, I think you're right. The connection is deeper even than it might initially appear. The Chaldean oracles, probably composed in the 2nd century CE, and attributed to Julian the Theurgist, although there are some arguments also that it might have been Julian the Chaldean, from Chaldea, who's Julian's father. Which doesn't really help us having father and son as Julian and both being magical workers or practitioners. But in that, and the fragments that we have, Hecate is presented as the world soul or the cosmic world soul. And she is perceived as the intermediary between the principle of the transcendent father and the material world. So if you like, Hecate is the buffer between pure thought and material, and so literally birthed the world and everything that is material. I think Proclus, working within the Neoplatonic tradition in the 5th century, describes her as the life-giving and intellectually luminous. And this isn't really a departure from her earlier character, but I think an elaboration of it, of the deity that stands between. And I think the Neoplatonists really helped in their work around the fragments from the oracles, really helped to develop some of this thinking and some of this idea. I think in the Porphyry's Cave of the Nymphs, I think that's, if I'm right, that's 3rd century. And I think that's really an allegorical reading of the passage from Homer's Odyssey. Exactly. And if you like, in the Odyssey, it's the cave which has the 2 entrances, one for the descent of souls into carnation and one for the ascent of souls out of it. So it becomes a map for the soul's journey through materiality and back to towards the divine. And that fits perfectly well with Hecate's torch-bearing liminal function. And, there's kind of some precision there about she's not really just the escort of the souls, but in the Neoplatonic reading, she governs the entire movement of the soul. And that's why I think Damascus can describe as the bond between the material and the divine realms. And there's no sense of contradiction there. And her role is central in making the link between them. And also, I think that, as you say, the psychopomp function is not a subsidiary feature. It's kind of key to her theological significance in that sense, and it's where the light makes the navigation possible across the boundaries that would otherwise be impassable.
Yeah, and when you talk about all those symbols that you are mentioning, like the torch, or like all those things that happens in the cult of Hecate, we see that happening also in a different way in the cult of Mithras, with these two characters, Cautes and Cautopatis, who are like with a torch, which is one of the important elements. This light that helps souls, right, to reach the higher realm and then to come back in this cycle of life and death, right, on transformation. That we can also interpret in our lives, how we navigate through our lives with their help. So I think that's one of the connections that we see with Mitra, with the Mithraic cult. Even though we don't have that many actual monuments or like a reference, like archaeological evidence of this connection, we do have some. And then we already talked before this conversation about this beautiful Hekation that was found in Sidon alongside a group of Mithraic monuments that are today preserved in the Louvre Museum. Vermazeren, in his like a corpus of Mithraic monuments, also mentions other references, like in Rome, in Trier, in Stockstadt, in Germany today. So we have not many, but there are some connections, and also we'll talk later on about like all these parallels. But there is also an inscription dedicated to Mithras from Zosimus, which is a certain person in that time that identifies himself as a priest of Hecate, and also pays for a Mithraeon. So you can see these parallels and these like connections where were common in the ancient world. Like you have a diversity of entities that you can worship, right? How do you interpret her presence into the Mithraic cult? If you can tell us a little more about what is your impression about how Hecate, maybe not only in the Mithraic context, but in other traditions or other cults.
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting, and I think I think on the first appearance, it seems that you're faced with a contradiction. So you've got a kind of the heroic, active, conquering figure, the cosmic warrior with Mithras, and then on the opposite of that, you've got this ambiguous governess of Queen of Witches, chthonic, dark side. But I think if you start to look beyond that, you see both of them are about light in darkness. Whether that's the solar-born god or whether that's the torchbearer carrying the light through. You've got the sun and the moon, which opposites, maybe opposites, but maybe not, because again they're both related to that kind of that solar light, that and that lunar light, and showing the way, showing the path. I think you've got also that key thing about operating across sets of thresholds. So with Mithras, Mithras killing of the bull, the passage of the soul, the planetary spheres, the movement between darkness and light, and the initiate in the Mithraic mysteries understood to be making the journey through the series or the grades of levels. Hecate, on the other hand, is the deity of the thresholds, the guider of the souls between realms. I mean, that's a very coherent presence in that context. She's not decorative; she's quite structural in recognizing that there are those journeys, whether they're allegorical journeys or cosmic journeys, that need to be made, and help in the passing through those journeys. So. And I think in the later tradition, as we've been talking about in terms of the Chaldean oracle, Hecate as the world soul was available to whoever commissioned or used the monuments, the Sidon monuments. And I think that would have been very well understood, that she brings some of that cosmological authority. And I think that would sit very alongside, the work, the workings, and the cult of Mithras.
I think indeed there are a lot of parallels, but also like they correspond to different maybe psychologies or like different ways of see or operate with the divine, right? So probably this cult of Mithras corresponds much more to this let's say solar structure, a male center psychology or psyches or like a and then Hecate will correspond to more to this learner, like a liminal associated with the feminine, right? It's probably two different, how do you say, like forms or ways to do the same, to reach the same results, probably because we found as well this like a psychopomp um, guide, and then there's like a different, and even that is, it is interesting to see that both of them are Catonic um, gods, right? Like they correspond to, because even though Mithras is solar in its definition, he's also like a worship underground. So in that regard, there is a lot of parallels that.
Yeah, and I think Nat and I, we often have this conversation about, um, actually, if light is so bright, it obscures. You know those moments when you stand in such bright sunlight that you can't see anything. And so I think it's a case that the light and the darkness actually need each other, and they
Mhm.
create
Yeah.
the possibility of the path. So if we were just in pure light and pure splendor, we everything would be obscured from us. And so actually we need the darkness sometimes to be able to see more clearly. Ironically, I think it's a beautiful paradox in a way.
Exactly. And then, so I think it's interesting also to explore this like a feminine that we can find in Hecate, and that is almost absent. Uh, let's say almost absent in the Mithraic cult, even though there is also some reference to Hecate, for instance, right, from time to time. So you write in your book about how powerful goddesses could become feared or diminished under patriarchal systems. Do you think that Hecate can be understood as a figure of female agency in antiquity, or that is just like a modern way of reading her?
I think this is a really interesting question. I think there are many books and articles to write on this, because I think both are true in a sense, and I think it's worth just kind of taking a minute to reflect on this rather than to try and resolve it too quickly. I mean, the historical record is clear that Hecate's independence from patriarchal religious authority is structural rather than incidental in her mythology. So, she was not one of the goddesses that could be defined by her relationship with the patriarchy. So she wasn't the wife of in the way Hera was. She wasn't the daughter of in the way Athena was. She didn't represent the feminine qualities in the way that Aphrodite did. So, and she held dominion across all three realms independently. She wasn't beholden to a male consort or a protector. She wasn't tamed into domesticity. She wasn't subordinated into a supporting role. And that's not a modern reading. That's what the ancient sources describe, including Hesiod, who I wouldn't say was exactly a feminist writer in any contemporary sense. But, so Hecate was never defined by her relationship with male deities. But also the demonization is equally historical. So it seems to me that the deities, the goddesses that resist patriarchal structures get diminished or narrowed or made monstrous when cultural conditions demanded it. And the process by which Hecate was removed from the broad sovereignty in Hesiod was really, as described in later traditions, as malevolent night wanderer, and started to really challenge what really challenged the archetype and the stereotype of what women or female deities could and should be. And I think what's interesting in terms of you mentioned the word agency, and I think what's interesting in terms of agency is that the newest wave, maybe the last 70 years or so, we see a new relationship with Hecate is seeing her as more central, and seeing and being venerated by people who understand, particularly by women, who understand that it's an opportunity to reclaim some agency, and to reclaim some power, that has been maybe sidelined or maybe diminished in a historical context. So it's no surprise in a way that there's a contemporary growth in her following, and that's been accelerated in times when women have much more freedom to claim their own authority. And I don't think it's any coincidence either that the goddess was demonized for refusing to be beholden, and then diminished and sidelined, certainly through Christian traditions, where she didn't fit comfortably with inside, maybe partly because she wasn't understood that well, but didn't fit inside the archetypes that were seen as desirable of women at that time.
And talking about veneration, in your book, you also make a very interesting distinction between invocation and evocation. Could you explain how these two approaches differ in practice and what they tell us about how ancient people interacted with the divine?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to, because I think today the distinction, it's important, but it tends to get sort of collapsed under popular treatments, and the two are sometimes used interchangeably without understanding that there are two very different functions going on there. So invocation is an internal operation, and that's where you are calling a deity into yourself and into your own consciousness and body, and working with a kind of alignment or an identification. And I think probably a really good example is looking at the work of the Theosophists at the turn of the 20th century. So to invoke the deity within you and to be the channel or the vessel for that communication.
Is this some sort of possession somehow?
Yeah,
Or that?
yeah. Yeah, yeah, there's kind of a range in there, but yes, certainly a kind of possession or channeling, or oracle work often also is involved in invocation. So it's internal to you, whereas evocation is the external operation. So you are calling a deity to appear before you. There is a distinct presence, a distinct energy, and there is a clear boundary between the practitioner and the deity, and both experiences also carry different kinds of risks. So I think in ancient magical tradition, and certainly in the PGM, both invocation and evocation appear, and they're treated as distinct procedures, and they require very different preparations, different spaces, different protective protocols. Evocation in particular, very careful containment is used, so whether it's a triangle, a boundary, naming of what or who you are summoning, because you're working with a power that you're not absorbing but engaging. And the ancient practitioner took the distinction very seriously because it mattered in practice, not just in theory. And I think that also tells us about how ancient people understood the divine, in that they didn't flatten them into abstraction. A deity was a real presence with genuine agency, and the question of how you meet that presence, how you open yourself to that, whether you place it before you, it was a technical and a theological question, if you like.
There is something interesting. You say that figures like the Madonna della Strada absorb certain aspect of Hecate in the Middle Ages. How does Hecate survive into Christian context, and how does she end up reduced to a more, as you put it, one-dimensional goddess of witchcraft?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting area to explore. So, if we see the first thing that started to happen with Christianization, of course, is that the public ceremonies or public rituals that started to become more private, and so what we started to see is that certainly with Hecate, that her devotion started to be within the household and within the threshold rather than externally in a temple or at the crossroads. So people started to practice more privately. So the Diepnon ritual, the Diepnon supper, was an example of that, where that people would clean something in their home and they would make an offering, but it would be less public. And that was an example of how Hecate devotion continued to practice through the times. But of course, the other way that happened was also through the syncretism, if you like, of Hecate being absorbed into more acceptable religious saints or worshipped through religious characters. So you can see, for the example of Mary as the intercessor, as the presence of the threshold and the protector of travellers and the vulnerable. Or the Madonna della Strada, Our Lady of the Road, which carries a very clear resonance with Hecate's familiarity at the crossroads or on the road. And so we started to see that what could be absorbed was absorbed, and what couldn't be absorbed was expelled and then demonized. And that's where we see that, the aspect of Hecate that couldn't be absorbed into Christian liturgy, if you like, then became expelled from it. And I think it was the Canon Episcopi, I think a church document from around about the 10th century, which describes women who believe they ride out at night with Diana explicitly named. And it was treated as a diabolical delusion. And Diana and Hecate at this point had become quite interchangeable in some popular traditions. But and if they couldn't be absorbed into, the emerging Christian framework, they became immersed in the form of diabolism. And it's rich and it's complex, and it was started to compress some of those functions and make those divisions. So in that sense, the Queen of the Night became governed by the dangerous, the uncontrollable, and those aspects of the feminine power that weren't seen to be acceptable in the Christian tradition of that time. But I think it's probably worth noting that she never entirely disappeared. Even in the diminished form, tradition persisted underground, and it was distorted. And in the early modern witch trials, the residue of those practices were continued to be exemplified.
And well, one of the theses of your work, or theses or like proposals, right? Because this is like the subtitle of your book. It's or the part of the title of your book, the Rites of Hecate, from the dirt to the divine. And then this from the dirt to the divine, which is quite intriguing, right? It's a way to structure practice across different axes, and then you explain those axes. That's quite interesting. It's like a very structured way to look at it. How do someone today will approach Hecate in a way that feels meaningful, but also grounded, based on this proposition that you have in your book?
Yeah, well, thank you for mentioning the book again. I appreciate that. So, actually, the model that I shared in the book came as a part of being asked to write the book. So I was trying to help make sense of my own practice and trying to understand a way that I could communicate that. And as I think you know me, so you know that a part of my practice is very grounded in terms of some traditionalism, because I do believe in going back to understanding what was actually meant, rather than taking a light and less serious view of what is. So so the starting point for me was that my work was internal to myself, and learning about myself. And it was grounded, and so that's whether that's in ancestral, understanding my ancestry, where I come from, what do I believe in, but it really started by putting my hands in the dirt, and very literally for me, growing stuff and learning about who I am. And so there are the two axes that kind of help to describe that process. The first is the internal to the external, and the second is from the dirt to the divine. And as we've talked in this conversation, really, you can see that the understanding of Hecate is that she operates from the chthonic to the oronic, from the dirt to the celestial. And you have to understand that whole spectrum of where she comes from or what she represents in order to be able to walk that path. But you can't just do that without starting of understanding yourself as well and putting yourself in your own practice. Why are you doing this? What is this about? What is your ego? What is your ancestry? So that's the internal work. And then the external work in terms of more of, what you're producing, the tools, the rites, the rituals. And then ultimately, if you're taking both of those dimensions, it's kind of linking to the divine, and the high ceremonial, the external ceremonial. And I think for many practitioners, they locate themselves in one of those quadrants, but don't necessarily reflect on where they're coming from in terms of their own journey. So what are the roots that allows the tree to grow, if you like, in that sense?
And then talking about a little bit about practice, and then just to end this conversation, that I really thank you a lot. I learn a lot, and I think your book I recommend that to everyone that wants to know a little more about this, like a goddess that is not that known, and it's also fascinating. Talking about practice, you also, as I was saying, your book is also a very personal account of your encounter somehow with this deity and your tradition and everything that you have been telling us. And then, in particular, you talk about something that I was very interested in. This encounter that you have like an actual encounter with Hecate, in a very experiential way. How did it happen, and how does it shape your understanding of her beyond the academic?
Yeah, I suppose if I go back, well, I suppose the starting point for me is that I'm not sure that you ever uh, start by working with Hecate. I think she starts by telling you you're going to work with her, and you can ignore that for a very long time, and then eventually you realize that your own free will and agency isn't necessarily as much as it was. But for me, there were two entry points really. The first is that when I was in my mid-20s, I did a regression hypnotherapy regression session on past life, and this past life was so I the way that I was led. Somebody led me through this trance state. I don't know if you've ever done a past life regression, but you go through a trance state, you go on a journey, you get to a door, and when the door opens, you're at the end of a life. And so this voice, this person that was leading me through this said, so when you go through the door, tell me what you can see. And so I looked around and said, I can't see anything. And this voice said, no, just look a bit harder. What can you see? And I said, no, I can't see anything. There's nothing. There's nothing. He said, well, when you say there's nothing, and I could hear, even though I was in translate, I could hear this tiny bit of panic in this voice of this person guiding me. So look harder. What can you see? When you say nothing, what do you mean? I said, well, it's like very dark grey. I can't see anything. It's nothing. And what we realized as we took me through the end of that life to the beginning of that life is actually at the end of that life, I was basically a beggar woman. It was probably around about, I'm not sure, of course, I've no idea, but around about 13th or 14th century. Could have been France, could have been Britain, not sure, but the terrain was recognizable to me in that sense. But I was at the end of a life, blind with cataracts, deaf, profoundly deaf, and I fell in a ditch and I died. So I wasn't the handmaid of Cleopatra. I wasn't Queen Anne. I wasn't any other wonderful, great, magical practitioner. I was, sadly, I was just a sad beggar woman who fell in a ditch and died. having led a miserable short life. And that that is one of the stories that I tell at the beginning of the book. And I didn't realize when I was writing the book that actually it had much more significance than I thought, because when we were talking about Hecate's hoard and thinking about who is involved in Hecate's hoard, it clearly is the people like them, those who died before their time, those who had a violent death, those who were left unburied. They were the people that she brought into her company, into her hoard. And in that sense, I think, although we've always defined Hecate as the queen of witches and stuff, what we've never really acknowledged is the compassion and the unconditional love that is required to bring people into your company, to give people what they, bodies and spirits, what they never had before, being a part of something. And so I would often argue with people who say, characterize Hecate as this evil queen of witches. I think there's a real misunderstanding that actually walking with Hecate has within it unconditional love and acceptance of people in the way that they're marginalized and put on the edge of society, but they're brought into being a part of something. And so that's why that story becomes very important to me in the beginning of the book, because it was only through running one of our courses on the rites of Hecate in Lemnos that we actually started to really explore and understand something about Hecate's hoard and what it means to become a part of something when you've never really experienced that before. And that character that fell down in the ditch and died I can't say, but may or may not have become a part of Hecate's hoard and been gathered up and brought into something which she hadn't experienced before. But the other area where I talk about in the book is I do transpersonal work, and so transpersonal work is really creating that opportunity to talk with aspects of oneself. And in doing that, you create space. So I created a transpersonal house, which is a traditional way of doing it. So this has got kind of, not exactly mind palace, but that kind of direction. So I create a space, a house that I can go to in trance state, and I can talk with aspects of myself, and learn from myself, and work with myself. Because I had quite a lot of physical challenges and medical challenges, I also created a side to the transpersonal house, what I call the vaulted lab, which is a transpersonal lab where I could go specifically to talk about, things that don't work. So when I go into my transpersonal lab, it's full of junk, which is basically broken bits of my body. So, and I said for a long time in a corner, although it's kind of looks like an old alchemist lab, and that's how I've created it. It's got a furnace and an alembic and, that kind of stuff around it. And there's a balcony, kind of a mezzanine at the top, and an old wooden staircase coming down, very simple. And the first time I went into the lab, I saw who I immediately knew was Hecate, and I hadn't worked with Hecate at this point, but I immediately knew it was her, standing at the top of the staircase and starting to descend. So I go around the alembic to the furnace to meet her, and when I get there, she's not there. And instead, there's this quite short, grumpy, sandy-haired coloured man in a waxed apron, and he looks at me and he laughs and he said, "The first lesson is don't always assume that what you see is what is." And his job was really to put me in my place and to take me down. So I thought I was going to be greeted by the goddess and welcomed into something, and I wasn't. I was welcomed into my lab by a very surly character who has always made my life challenging and posed difficulties to me.
Well, thank you so much, Lenni. For everyone who is listening to this, if you want to know more about this, like a very personal, but also very grounded and very academically sustained and very interesting, don't miss this excellent book by Lenni George, The Rites of Hekate, From the Dirt to the Divine. You can find it, I think, it's like a Venezia Venezia publication. So I think you can find it on their website.
Yeah, Beneficia Publications, Amazon, Waterstones. It's out there.
And also on your website, because you can go. I recommend people, if they are interested in the work that you are doing, to visit the House of Sophiel websites, where you will find more, and also your Substract, and then other things that you are doing. I will put all the links and all the information below this video. So really, thank you so much. Was as usual grateful to. I'm very grateful to talk to you, and then hope that we see each other pretty soon.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've loved having the opportunity to talk with you again and see you again this morning. Thank you.